The newly true continued. I want to point out some more about what I was referring to last meeting as the newly true. The newly true being a futuristic alteration of all concepts, including the past. The newly true being, in a sense, a form of the correct, not just a form of the truth, as ordinary people call it, but the newly true being a form of the correct, and the correct being that which you could look at ad hocly as that which is usefully true. Do not worry about going around in circles because you have never worried about it before. It would be the correct would be that which is usefully true until the next temporary update. The newly true would be a redefining at the time, suddenly, of what is apparently you and what has apparently happened to you in your 3D life thus far. The newly true would be the ultimate in operational directives. The newly true would be exemplary, if this was possible, of real scientific theorems, except it would almost go linearly backwards. It would be theorems into axioms. That is, given truths would follow and precede and fall in the middle of so-called theorems. The newly true would be a kind of corrected view of time. If you attempted to write on white paper with a white pen, based upon all of our experience with Captain Kangaroo and Ding Dong School, I assume that you know that you can't see it. If we will let this represent time, is this showing up all right?
Yes.
Then that which would be invisible, that which would be inexplicable, that which would seem irrelevant, that which would seem extraneous, that which simply is not a part of ordinary consciousness, becomes so. This is one two-dimensional, made-up example of how you could look at the newly true. The newly true, as I mentioned several ways that you might look at it if you can see it at all, as being an ultimate in operational directives, as being exemplary of would amount to a 4D kind of scientific theorem, or being a corrected view and understanding of time itself, or the newly true simply being that which is correct, not true, because if something's true, it can be untrue. If something's correct, for the time being, in the sense of it being useful, it's beyond being true or not true. It is used. It explains something. It does not necessarily explain anything that you can relay to anyone else. It does not necessarily explain that which you thought to yourself was that what you wanted explained. It does not necessarily answer questions that you had verbally formulated previously as being reasonable, important, necessary questions. It is a kind of background that jumps out. To stay with this two-dimensional example of me using that green watercolor as being representing time, is once you have some understanding, and many of you have already had the experience, most of you to varying degrees, of this occurring, and you took it at the time as being either a low-level mystical experience or the foretelling of upcoming mystical treats. But it is as though a background had jumped out in such a way that you can see with a new kind of depth. I've explained it, suggested it in many ways that you can begin to see things connected in a way you could not. That apparently you have stepped back from living face to face with parts of life, and it's as though you step back and now there is a sense of depth. It's as though, in fact, a 2D world becomes 3D. Taking off a little higher, it's as though a 3D world takes on yet another dimension. All of this falls within the realm, at least for the time being, that I started last week of referring to as the newly true. It seems to just suddenly jump up and be newly true. The newly true is singular, because the newly true, what I mean by it, the newly true, forget whether it's true for anybody else, forget whether it's even correct for anybody else. The newly true is correct for you, but the newly true does not travel well. It does not have the longevity or the travelability of 2,000-year-old buried Chinese eggs, for instance. It probably does not have the life expectancy or the travelability of ordinary eggs that's been refrigerated down at your local 7-Eleven. The newly true is yours. Of perhaps passing importance, I could also point out again why this kind of information is so hard, in a certain sense, to relate. That is difficult to write down and to hand out, to say the least, to groups of people, and they all look at it and get some similar message. To get anything close to a scenario of putting out a rather predictable common message, you have got to then begin to whittle, water down, dilute, twist the newly true to the point that it is almost pablum. Now I'm going to mention some more things and see if you or I one can stub your perception toe back on the newly true. As it relates to another area I mentioned at our last meeting, I was asking you, would it be better, would it be worse if you were what you pretend to be or what you truly are, assuming that there is such a difference? Before assuming there is such a difference, if I must, of course, I'll point out again that life makes everyone believe there is such a distinction, that there are two such aspects of each and every person. And then, of course, I concluded in a fashion by asking you what might be life's purpose in doing this. Having made that circle, if not spiral, let's go back to, if it is indeed a fact as everyone believes. How about doubly aside? How long am I going to have to talk about what people believe? What people believe. Is that not strange by now? Even though I intend each time we meet to convey something and keep it down to as much of a verbal shorthand as possible, for people to believe things, everything that seems to connote. One's belief and faith in such matters, I believe, is what might have been crumbling that made that noise a few minutes ago. I was certainly hoping so in some cases here. But at any rate, everybody is wired up to have this, whatever it is, called a belief, that there is a pretend you and there is a real you. Even though people cannot seem to adequately distinguish between the two or define them in a satisfactory manner, let's go ahead and assume that everyone is correct, which I guess is a fairly safe assumption. If you're going to live here on this planet, if everybody believes something, Just my offhand suggestion now I think about it is, go ahead and believe it. What the hell? But could you people see, even within that framework, that the concept of a pretend you, based upon one other aspect I mentioned last week when I asked you, could you possibly see from any of you that the so-called real you that people speak of could be seen as a function primarily of the lower red and blue circuits, whereas this apparent pretend you could be seen as arising primarily from the yellow circuits. Everybody remembers that. All right. Keeping all of that in mind, then could any of you see that the idea of one's pretend self, could you see it as being a kind of key phrase regarding the possible purpose of human life? That is will you take my suggestion, that may be a splendid, it might be one of the more splendider verbal phrases pointing toward the possible purpose of human life is the existence of a pretend self. Of course, by most accounts, I guess we'd be safe in saying right now, today, that this dichotomy, this apparent dichotomy in people, is really a psychological problem. Or with anyone who was still genetically old enough, we think it was a spiritual problem between man's better side and his worser side. That there would be, if indeed there is a basis for believing of these two possibilities within each person, that would either be due to some spiritual flaw, some spiritual transgression that the gods are punishing man for, or that it is some kind of psychological weakness. But I ask you again, can any of you perceive, glimpse, based upon the kinds of things I mentioned last week, and I remind you of, that this pretend self could be verbally the most excellent hint regarding the possible purpose of human life? Okay, that is the possibility of growing above the red and blue circuit. That is, to evolve above the chemical level. Could anybody see that as being a most splendid possible verbal hint regarding man's purpose? Here, man as opposed to mountains, trees, and otters. This kind of growth that I am suggesting might be hidden within the phrase pretend self. There might be a verb behind the apparent noun of one's pretend self. If this kind of growth, if this kind of process as opposed to a thing, this kind of verbal reality as opposed to a out, down, spot noun, this kind of growth would require two things I want to mention. Would require a continuing willful consumption of E, and it would secondly require a continuing inflow of newly true data. Now let's take the E first. I mentioned this a little bit last time. To facilitate the kind of growth that might be hiding behind the conception of one's pretend self, this dissatisfaction that in some way I've got two sides to me and they have got to be pulled together. They've got to be put back together, perhaps. But that I am running in two directions all the time. I am pulled by ambivalent feelings, conflicting desires, etc. At the first aspect that I want to mention, the increasing willful consumption of E, is that you must personally strive for your own lateral expansion. And this is done by widening the net of your own perception. It is done through such things as, in the wonderful world of anacronyms, as not staring, continually casing the joint, because what I really mean, closer to what I mean by the willful consumption of E, is you are attempting to laterally widen the net of your own perception, just in everyday affairs, just everywhere. What you are attempting to do, and what you will succeed in doing, is that you pull in more and more of what would seem to be the 3D irrelevant. And you turn it into useful fuel. Whereas at the ordinary level, what you would do is apparently only deal with C and D. That you would apparently be living your life in action and living your life in the world of thinking of action, of always dealing with only the two types of energy, the two name types, directions of the wind flow. At one time, when I last time we met, decided to describe it this way, I expected to feel a greater reaction from you people here on the consumption of E, since I had mentioned that in passing many moons ago. But you are missing an absolutely splendid possibility of a new direction, because all of you, every one of you, have done this. You have benefited from it. You have experienced it yourself. But by having some map of it, it makes it more useful. And that is that many of the times that you thought that something extraordinary happened, that you had had a moment of some kind of new consciousness, an hour, overnight, a whole week of inexplicable joy and new energy, the reason for which was inexplicable. One of the ways that you could have attempted to see it through newly true eyes, which affects the past, remember, the apparent past, would be seeing that in some way you had burned, you had consumed some of what seemed irrelevant. And let us say that some days before, some weeks before, some hours before, something had happened that fell strictly, as far as you were concerned, in the realm of C versus D. Bad luck. TS. Most likely. And something terrible or semi-terrible had befallen you, and through whatever means, through remembering some trick, some anacronym, some joke that I had made, or something that you had put together, it's as though here is this impending, perhaps rout of your little castle by all of these dastardly little knights, and you thought, well, I'm going under. I'm going under again, maybe for the third time, and apparently you withstood the onslaught, or apparently the onslaught never really got going good. Something seemed to have happened. Maybe the guide stepped in and went, give the kid a break this time. It seems as though not only did you get through it in a completely unexpectedly good condition, but you seem to have benefited from it in some way. If you could have seen it in the right way, there are several ways that you could see it through newly true data. But one of the ways is that at the time you began to consume the irrelevant, you took what appeared to be unconnected to what was going on. If you stared at what was going on, of, oh my God, the ship's going down, rather than staring at it, you attempted not to stare, you attempted to continually case the joint, and you begin to take that which normally would have been irrelevant from your binary perception, you begin to burn it, consume it. You pulled it in to the heat of the moment. And something different happened. The outcome was not what you expected. You were not limited to your choice of either leaded or unleaded. You had a third choice. And the exhaust was not what normally happens. The way in which the engine ran was not at the ordinary level of torque. The byproducts were not the same. Something different happened. I could absolutely, as I can do many times, of course, tell you that a real mystical trick, the mystical step, the secret step that everybody misses almost all the time on this planet, is by ignoring the necessity to consume the irrelevant. That if I'm going to do anything extraordinary, I pretty darn well know what it is before I have to meet some famous guru. I pretty well know. I've read enough, I've thought enough. I just seem to, I don't know, instinctively know what it is that a person on the mystical path, the pilgrim before he gets trapped forever at Vanity Fair and Disneyland, that I darn well know the general direction to go. Just what I need is a little help, a little more information, maybe a slight push, but you know, it's no big secret how to be a better person. All the religions tell it. New Age philosophers of every age always point out, hey, all religions are the same. All would-be mystical systems are the same. All roads lead to Mecca, or to Rome, or to Jerusalem, or to Barstow. And so everyone believes that I know more or less where we're going. And you do not. Because the only place that the internal wired up compass runs is somewhere between C and D. That's it. You can say that you're going anywhere. You can say that your intention is to go to Mecca, to Rome. But where you're going to go falls between C and D on the compass. And that's it. You can go nowhere else. You can understand nothing outside the area between C and D. You can experience nothing other than, hey, I'm real happy. Nah, I'm pretty well pissed. Hey, I'm excited this happened. No, I'm not. This is a bummer. Yeah, I got to admit, I do love you. No, wait. Not love. Jeez, I don't even like you. Wait a minute, what a splendid idea I just heard. That's got to be true. No, that's irrational. No. That's the only place you can go, is somewhere between the two. That's it. Religion is not going to cure it. It's not supposed to. It's the promise of delivery of services. Psychology is not going to cure it. Same thing. And you should see that talking to yourself is not going to cure it, because the only thing you do is on the compass you got 2 points to read. To you, an ordinary person, the wind only blows from 2 directions. That's it. It's not so much, if you're following any of this, a matter that you need in a 3D sense, new information. It is that you need the ability to receive new information. But everyone is wired up to believe that all information, anything that's worthwhile, for worthwhile substitute almost any synonym that you can find. Useful, profitable, reasonable, rational, spiritual, good, decent, beneficial, that any such knowledge, which is, from a binary view, the only good knowledge, is going to fall within the spectrum between C and D. That's it. And that is only, in a 3D world, that is only supremely reasonable. If my quest for some greater understanding, for some greater human ability, for something extraordinary in this lifetime, if it were equal to the study of manned flight, then anything that just patently had nothing to do with flight, such as animal husbandry, such as the intricate syncopated bass patterns of James Brown's rhythm section, especially during the late 60s and early 70s, all of that is irrelevant, to say the least. Everything in the world that does not have some reasonable connection to manned flight would be a detriment to my study were I to spend time on that, correct? Yeah, that is correct, if you're ordinary. But of course we're not talking about ordinary affairs, and I'm not addressing these comments at this time to ordinary people. If you're going to get out of the binary standoff, if you're going to get out of the confines, it is not going to be through happenstance, it is not going to be through imagined gifts from the gods. One of the primo descriptions for 1987 I'm suggesting to you would be that you have got to learn to take the irrelevant, since it happens anyway, but to learn to willfully burn it. You have got to willfully drag it into what apparently is under your consideration, to what is apparently this particular problem. A real aside, but sometimes I guess I assume it's worthwhile to try and drag this down for a second to real everyday affairs. All of you are surely familiar with the stories. They try to make things out of them psychologically and intellectually, but about scientists who run across what seems to be a brick wall in their study, and how they go for weeks and months, and then while they're out playing golf, while they're asleep, while they're eating dinner, and somebody says, "Would you pass me the egg knife?" And the guy says, "I'll reach for the egg knife," and suddenly it hit me. DNA would look like those kind of stories. Does anybody see any connection? Back to the heart of the meal. That is, back to where I was. The fuel available for this kind of natural, necessary lateral expansion has got to lay the kind of groundwork. It's the kind of thing to which you can apply yourself from moment to moment. To not staring, continually casing the joint. What I mean behind all those words. Trying to pull in the irrelevant forces an expansion of what you perceive to be relevant. It will clinically, as long as you can hold on to it, it will alter what seems to be your perception of the extremes of what is possible, what is not possible, what seems to be the outside boundaries of the true and the false, of reality and imagination, of all the dichotomies you can think of. When you begin to pull in the irrelevant, it makes it easier for the background of time to show itself. Withal, if you do not do that, if you stay within the perception that everything can be explained in a binary sense, if you really believe, as intriguing, as captious as is, the idea of yin-yang, that explains everything, which hell it does. It explains every ordinary thing on this planet if you're ordinary. And as would-be philosophers and thinkers that use the yin-yang, they point out, rightfully so, they sell books, run whole systems pointing out, shame on you people, you can't remember that there's yin-yang. You can't remember that there's the hard and then the soft, and the up and the down. That if you people could remember that, boy, you'll be as smart and as Chinese as I am. You too could be a Zen Buddhist, or a West Coast Buddhist, or a Barstow Buddhist. But that's nothing. To see yin-yang is like to get out of bed in the morning. Well, as far as you people are concerned, to see yin-yang, to say I have worked and I can continually see and think of and feel yin-yang is to say, hey, I'm breathing. You have got to continually attempt to pull in, to drag in the irrelevant. And you don't start off attempting to rename it. Don't start off and say, well, all right, I remember what he said, and it seemed to have struck a little note, so I'm going to try to pull in the irrelevant. What's the irrelevant? And then you start saying, well, all right, I'll consider this in this situation because it's not completely irrelevant. You're already staring. Don't rename it. Don't say, well, this probably does have some connection. I can see, now that I really look at it in a peculiar way, I can see how animal husbandry could be related to man flight. Because this one aspect, at least, of animal husbandry does have some connection. Jesus. You blew it. Don't rename it. Don't talk about it. You have to drag it in. Don't rename it. If you rename it, then it's just part of C and D, one or the other. Don't rename the irrelevant. If you try to talk about it, if you try and see, well, this is connected in the sense of talking about it, it's no longer E. It is now relevant. It's either C or D. When do you think I'm going to either learn, if I don't know how, or else go ahead and start sometimes talking in 4D language instead of 3D? Ha-ha. Sometimes I do. You people just misname it. You think I didn't know what I was saying when it happened. You think I lost my place. You think I mispronounced not a word, a whole paragraph. The irrelevant, insofar as fueling the would-be revolution in you, the irrelevant almost acts like oxygen. It facilitates a combustion. It facilitates a firing, a fueling that is not available under any other conditions, which is why no one can sit down in some way and think their way into some state of higher consciousness, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter what your IQ is. It doesn't matter how long you go to school. It doesn't matter who you study with. It doesn't matter what you do in your attempt to solely affect your yellow systems. You should see this. I'm not insisting I'm right. You should see this easily by now. You had enough experience to see that you're not going to think your way into heaven. You're not going to reason your way to paradise. And this system itself is not, in some way alone, going to ignite itself. It is not going to build itself. It is like expecting that they've reached the top floor, the proposed top floor of some new building, and instead of topping it out, well, they go away overnight. Overnight might be over a year, but they go away overnight, and the girders, the beams on the top floor, overnight some way, build another floor. that in some way, miraculously, they produce new beams, new rivets, not just the material, but the ability that they build another floor on top of themselves. Give me a break, Jake. That is not a fact, Jack. That is similar to what the situation would be in believing that within the realm of C and D, which is what it takes to operate all systems, including the yellow circuit. The only way the yellow circuit knows anything is true by comparing it with what is false. The only way that the yellow systems know the definition of any word is that every other word in that particular language defines that one. That no matter where you start in the dictionary, it is satisfying. All you've got to do is take the time, and you'll go through every word in the dictionary to adequately define whichever one you start out with. It is pleasing. It is comforting. All circles are comforting. They're neat. And you're back where you started, and everything seems to explain itself. From a C-type view, from a D-type view, everything seems to disquiet itself. Everything seems to be pissing on its own foot over and over. It's just according to whether you seem to be, in a mechanical sense, a happy sort or an old sorehead. Which is, as I said, you can save time, or as Kyruk pointed out last time, from reading your biography, yours or anybody else's, if you want to know what causes somebody, by and large, their character, their personality, how it got shaped, the most important influences in their early years. Remember, he pointed out that you can save a lot of time, just skip those early years, because there is one great circumstance, there's one influential occurrence that happens and forms everybody, and that is they're born. Now, jump from there on up to 17 or 18 or whatever you think would be an interesting time. Up until then, I truly hope that no one will stop right there and take that as a 3D message. It's a 4D message. Besides what I mentioned of the necessity for continually, willfully increasing, once you learn how, once you see it, once you apply yourself to attempting to drag in the irrelevant and continually in all situations, but just continually. If there seems to be no pressing situation, just don't stare. Don't look for a goddamn situation. The desire from one viewpoint. Of course, all this, again, sounds like psychological descriptions, because it sounds as though we're talking about people who's instead of people what's. But I could describe this innate in everybody desire to stare. Another description is, it's the desire to look for C and D. That's not what it is, but that's the way I could describe it. That is an observable, verbalizable manifestation that I want to be in a staring state. I do not want to have to case the joint. I just want to stare. It's natural. Beyond the need to willfully struggle with that was the second part I mentioned. And the kind of growth that would be behind, I suggest to you, the notion that there is a pretend self in all of us, that it is a very fair, it may be in fact a dangerously correct description of the possible purpose for human life. The verb hidden behind the noun, the pretend self. The other aspect that I mentioned, the second one, that would be necessary to sustain this, is you have got to have a continuing flow of truly new data. And within this area, I want to mention again that it may not be simply a matter of increasing your apparent need for it, your apparent desire for it, which all of you at one time or the other in your early days here asked me one way or the other, how can I seem to increase my need? It's about time I suggest to you that you look at it another way. It may be that rather than just looking at it as a desire to increase your need, your desire is to some way facilitate better digestion of truly new data, of newly true data. At one time, I believe I allowed Kyrut to write one of his little epitaphs that went something like this. Is there a difference between information that might be interesting and information that apparently is useful? Now that could form a real triaxial field of inquiry. Are there two kinds of information? Just to you personally. There seems to be information that's interesting, and then there seems to be information that is, by God, downright useful. There seems in many cases, or at least in some cases, to be a quite real felt distinction. It would be possible to defend, to support such a view in the 3D world. But let's go beyond that and me say that you need to rethink your position regarding the ingestion of new data on this particular basis, at least for tonight. That all of the info, the data that I attempt to convey to you is useful. And that doesn't matter that if at first blush to you individually, it simply appears to be interesting. That apparently it has no practical value. But by God, it's interesting. You want to remember it. It might be good to bring up in chitting and chatting. Maybe someday you could turn it into a cosmic question in a trivial game. That by God, this is simply interesting. You don't see any significance, it just strikes you as interesting. You're wrong. If it is interesting, it is useful. Now this is not simply interesting. What I'm talking about now, it's useful. And it's beginning to turn in a 3D world to a hall of mirrors. So listen quick. At least some of you get dizzy. For example, last time we met, right at the end of the taping, I was pointing out to you some 3D, unknown, unrecognized, uninvestigated, but some 3D scientific facts having to do with there being a 5-second maximum time that an ordinary person gets if we isolate and artificially pick out some new input of information. Something just happens, somebody just jumps out from behind the corner, a truck just goes by and somebody shouts out a curse at you. But we isolate that from the continuum of the triaxial dance and call that one thing that is new energy coming in. It takes, under ordinary conditions, ordinary people, a maximum of 5 seconds for that energy to reach all extremes of your universe, of your system. And it takes, if you recall, I pointed out, a maximum of 3 seconds for it to become a continuing part of trace elements in a man's memory, even if it doesn't reach all of the immediately accessible areas. Now I point out for you people that you have maximum time of 1 second for that which starts that chemical. You have a maximum of 1 second to stop it from becoming electrical. You have that which is 3D passing. You have less than 1 second to stop it from becoming personally permanent in you. You have less than 1 second to stop when you glance at the paper and you begin to read, 4 children burn, and you don't want to read it. You don't even want to know about it. You, in fact, peripheral vision, molecularly speaking, see the headline says 4 children burn in painful, horrendous fire in New Jersey. And you got less than 1 second that you can actually stop that from even reaching trace memory levels. But you got less than 1 second not to read it. You've seen it, but you cannot read it, and it does not even reach the level, the intensity of ordinary memory. It is what I keep trying to describe in obviously imperfect terms, is you do not think the thought. It's there. It's almost like an inverse echo. So I know what it is. It's almost as though you looked and saw the headlines, you looked and saw the event, and you can look away, whether you do it externally or internally. You look away, and for all intents and purposes, for only a few people, this is irrational. It's not even true. Out in the real world, it's correct, though, for the few people. And you've got to find out how to use it, or else you continue to take you as being this binary thing that sees things and reacts either positively or negatively, or in some binary fashion. But everything that happens to you, happens to you. Everything that you think, hey, I thought. Yeah, I don't like it now that I rethink it. But hell, I thought it. And talk about the past, all the things I've done, Jesus. They're going to have to extend the store hours for karma. I'll never be able to work this out. I did it. What else can I tell you? I did it. Oh, I can explain it. I can show you how I was almost forced in. Or the feeling that this is a closed system. I couldn't help what I did. I'm so sophisticated, I won't even blame it on anyone personally. It is simply the force of a closed system. All I did is a free will or a what? Ha! A joke. I couldn't help it. But none of that by itself will do. None of that will free a person. None of that will allow you to ingest, to digest any newly true, any fresh, any extraordinary information. All right. If you recall where I was in this paragraph, the information that you've got 1 second to stop the chemical from becoming electrical. You got 1 second to stop your own mechanical wiring system from thinking this thought, from feeling this feel, from doing this do, as the wolf would say. That, what little I mentioned it last time, struck many people that were listening as being very interesting. But then what? It's very interesting. I'll even write it down and see what I make of it. It was not interesting. It was not limited to that. It was not merely interesting. It's useful. Just because I didn't tell you how to do it, just because I didn't say, here is a new weapon, here is a new task, it may just sound as though it's interesting. Either theoretical, you may think, well, you're saying that in some manner as a parallel. You don't mean that really literally. Somebody would have figured that out before. I don't even think it's true. At any rate, it sounds interesting. Maybe I'll think about it. Maybe I'll write it down. It is not fucking interesting. It's useful. The idea, the correct idea that I'm telling you that everything that is interesting in a revolutionary sense is useful. I don't tell you anything that's simply interesting per se. Anything is simply novel, just something I just made up, or something that I threw some kind of 4D I Ching sticks, or something, just came up with a weird idea. I'm like, boy, that's so weird, it's interesting. This kind of information, however life does it through certain people, those kind of people, it doesn't even compute. I can't come out with cuteness or neatness or weirdness for the sake of weirdness. It's all useful. But I know that many, many times it strikes you at first blush that it's merely interesting. Now, it may be apparently seriously interesting. so novel that surely you want to write it down and remember it, because someday it might trigger something else. It was useful, I would not have said it. If you won't take this the wrong way, and you shouldn't by now, I can take it further. It's useful, I wouldn't have thought it. Which shows you how much you'd like to be locked up in my head over the weekend. Be sure and cut that out of the tape. At least stand to V and see this and get frightened, or... A few other matters before I get to a singular climax tonight. In my land of the states of Fred and Mary and Lower Slobovia, in this land, in the states, when you get into the cities, the people, capital T and capital P, the people rightfully feel most comfortable, most secure, in very thick, stable, heavy buildings. But when you get out and you're living in the bushes, and you're living out even beyond the fringes, the real revolutionist finds that he lives the freest from fear, from disquiet, when he is living in a temporary structure. Now, for the hydrogens and heliums among us tonight, if there was a difference between out there and in here, then let me point out, a temporary structure could be referring to the fact that if you were just living in a lightweight, movable lean-to that you had made, you don't have room to collect stuff. A temporary structure could be referring to the fact that if you were just living in a lightweight, movable lean-to that you had made, you don't have room to collect stuff. You're not going to have fear of a fire burning it down. Who cares? It cost you what? Nothing? Or $1? You're not going to fear theft. That'd be good for a small laugh. If while you were gone somebody came and tried to ransack your lean-to. There is nothing to fear. There's no loss to fear. There's no way to feel disquieted that somebody's going to break in and steal my possessions. You're not going to fear them increasing taxes. You don't pay taxes. You're not going to fear that something will happen and depreciate the land values. You're just kind of a squatter. There is a lot to be said. And I forgot, did I tell you that I was talking about real material stuff out there or some kind of psychological crap in here? I forgot what I said. Well, never. There would be a lot to be said for temporary structures. I might further point out that that which is newly true is a temporary structure, because it is correct, it is useful only until the next extraordinary update. If you try to hold on to the newly true, well, I'll tell you what you can do. You can choke that bastard until it simply becomes true. Then, of course, it's dead, and you can show it to somebody. You can even lay it down in a book and press on the pages, and it'll make these kind of figures that look like, what do you call them, words and stuff. You might be able to show it to somebody else. You can at least then handle it. It's then portable. It will then travel. that which is correct, that which is useful. New information is a temporary structure. If that were not true, but now we would have some kind, I would have revealed or come up with some permanent structure to this. Not just an external structure, there'd be some permanent, apparent teaching to all of this. At least I would stay with the same kind of terms and descriptions long enough that they would finally sink in, right? That if I just stay in one place, like if I'd stayed longer, for a few more years or a couple more decades, on describing man, the nervous system, about igniting areas beyond the ordinary level of consciousness. That was beginning almost to make sense. And Jesus Christ, it's been months since I even mentioned it. At least. Now, about the time it was beginning to sink in, and I was really playing with myself, and I kept redrawing the diagrams and thinking about it. And then you start all this stuff about revolutions and cities and states and the institutions and living out in the fringes. The only useful knowledge, the only useful place to find new data is in temporary structures. That's why if you go in the city and you find the buildings that look substantial, look stable, big marble buildings, these big old marble lines outside, and big old carved names in Latin even that have V's instead of U's, and you go inside and it seems to be peopled by nothing but men and women with thick glasses and lots of pencils in their pocket, studiously reading. You should know by now, there is no revolutionary knowledge there. The more stable it is, the less there is. Instead of hanging around the fringes of all of these shade tree gurus and mystics, maybe one should just go on back to one's church, back to the temple, back to the church, back to the mosque. Because at least, I know years ago when I was younger, I felt a certain kind of, I don't know, perhaps it was just teenage rebellion toward authority. But I drifted away. But now looking back, after having been through all this, these forms of touchy-feely, trying to live communally, trying to smoke dope all day and all night, trying to read weird books, Jesus, it all is like trying to grasp and hold on to smoke. Maybe I should go back to where at least, if they didn't have all the answers, at least there's some stability, that at least they seem to know what they're doing from one day to the next. Right? Yeah, it is true. That's why I said it is only the real revolutionist that understands the beauty, a kind of freedom from very mechanical but very real fear, the continual feeling of disquieting that comes from living in stable structures. For those of you that really think you're sharp, I can say living in stable structures, of course, is some kind of illusion anyway. Because even the marble Reichstag, somebody burnt down. They can make it out of marble. But the son of a bitch, you can burn it down. Who is going to come up with a fail-safe burglar system? If you can board up a building, if you can figure out how to do it, somebody else, just the other side of your head, somebody else can figure out how to get into it. No matter how stable, no matter how thick, no matter how apparently strong is the building, it can be burnt down, it can be broken into. That's why the king keeps somebody stand by the bed with a bazooka. That's why popes and priests all say, my life is in the hands of gods, but they say that behind bulletproof screens. Another aspect from last time is all power newly seized is a temporary structure. That's why it's possible to seize new power. If you have seized new power and in some way you cannot, through your own feeling, find it to be a temporary structure, you have seized a noun. You have seized power that expired just before you grabbed it. You, in your great haste, and your ability to run and elbow people, grabbed the very last jacket, the very last dress off that rack in the big sale. By the time you pulled it to your bosom and got ready to pay for it, you didn't realize it. The coat died. The dress went to Calvin Klein heaven. It's over. Newly seized power is always a temporary structure. I'm not going to stay right here, but I'll point out, if it were not so, it would not be power. It would not be useful unless it was temporary. If you indeed in some way believe, which would make it true, that you have absorbed at least one cosmic, irrefutable, irreversible truth, God's saying that you think you got it from me, but that you got one from somewhere. One little thing that after all of my apparent 3D cynicism and all the smart remarks from Kairoot, that somewhere there is one permanent, unchanging, omnipresent, omnipotent truth that you got hidden in your little bosom, you're a dead man. There is no power to it. You did not. Remember the words with which I sent forth. Who was it? St. Peter, St. Paul? Who was that other guy I sent out? You not only forgot those, you forgot the ever popular GKM. You got to keep moving. Ordinary people, when they apparently have seized new power. I knew you was going to ask me whether we're talking about some kind of real power, or are we talking about that you now have the ability apparently to deal with something that before would have swamped you in the great savanna of C and or D. By the irrelevant being dragged in and burned, something that should have floored you, something that should have annoyed you, something that was either a long-term or an apparently short-term expected case of the red ass, did not happen. You in fact felt better for it. That, am I talking about that kind of power? I don't know, kid, I'll leave it to you. In either case, it's the artificially described, artificially separated kind of situations I have to verbalize. If it occurred and you apparently gained new power from it, new strength, new understanding, and you do not see, you cannot attempt to keep yourself off balance, to keep yourself continually moving, and not to take what seems to be this new understanding, what seems to be this temporary moment of strength, or day of strength, as being anything other than a temporary structure. I keep saying you're going to kill it. Let's try another profitable way. It's going to choke you. Because you now believe, well, I've got another piece of permanent truth in my arsenal. I've got another straight arrow of undeniable truth in my little quiver. Is that what you call them? Little things on your back. Well, that little quiver on your back is going to turn into the size of Quasimodo and his family. You'll die from it. As far as this is concerned, you'll never be able to take part in any revolution. You'll step on the least bit of mushy ground, you're going to sink right in. The river's going to rise up to your ankles, then your knees, and then your little naughty parts, and first thing you know, you're done for. question. Out on the fringes, out in the bushes. See if you can ask yourself this along with me once I ask you this. Should the recruits be led to look upon this apparent inner struggle that all of this surely is, and I even describe it in these revolutionary and warlike terms of late, should the would-be revolutionist, should the recruit look upon this inner struggle that one is apparently engaged with oneself, should you look at as an invasion or an attempted liberation? Should you look at this struggle with whatever it is between you and something in here? Should you look at as being an invasion, that is, an aggressive act, one group or one person against another? Or should you look at as being liberation, that it is more of a helpful, friendly act to help release one of these parties, the other one, from some form of captivity, from some form? Is that interesting? Hell no. Oh, I know some of you thought it was. That's useful. If you merely find it interesting, you don't really find it. Is this apparent struggle? Don't sit there now or later when you try to neuralize this or to use it and worry about whether this is absolutely a struggle or whether it's just a poor binary reflection of what's really going on. It still appears to be a struggle. That's why I continue to use terminology. It apparently is a struggle somewhere in you. Could it be, as a matter of fact, now I think about it, could it be an apparent struggle between what seems to be one's real self and what seems to be one's pretend self? Could it be that? But there seems to be definitely a struggle going on. If there was not, then whatever it is, whatever aim that you think you formulated or that you may think you picked up from me, all right, I want to go from being this, what I am now, to being that. You'd do it. There's obviously something standing in the way. There's obviously friction, resistance. So there's some kind of struggle between some part of you and some other part of you. Well, there is another question I could ask on top of this. Not only should you look at it as being this struggle, an aggressive type act, one party toward another, an invasion. It's like the good part of me, the part of me that wants to be better, the part of me that wants to expand, the part of me that wants to be exceptional, has got to invade the dumb part. The revolutionist has got to invade the city. You got to attack the common man. You got to attack all of the common people that are run by habit, lower circuits. It is absolutely an act of aggression. That's what this is about. Or are the people, the side of me, the aspects of me that seem to be weak, fearful, timid, uncertain, is it not really that they're that way? It's just they've been captured by delusion, by ignorance, by the weight of physical habit. And it's what I'm attempting to do as a revolutionist, is in some way go in the city and liberate the people. I'm not going to attack them. I'm not invading the city. I'm going in and liberate them. And in some way, the common man, the people, will blossom. They're simply now downtrodden. They're in some form of slavery. Which way should one look at it? There's another question I started to ask, but I think I'll leave it. It's connected to the same area. But there are several other things I want to say before we get to tonight's meaty part. There is a certain kind of fog that surrounds all would-be revolutionists, all the recruits. And they are driven almost to forever. They are driven always to do this, but then it goes on almost to ever. And that's to worry. And of course, they must talk about it. About, is the time right to act? Or is the time not right to act? Is this the proper season to go ahead and make a move? If not the big move, at least any move. Is the time right to act? I'm going to finish this up in the 3 and the 4D world. In the 3D world, the real revolutionist could answer this question in 3 words. No! He can answer this in 4 words. No! So he let it, unlet it, and let it again. He could answer this in 3 words, and he could answer this in 4 words, or he could answer this in 3 words. Yeah, that's it. Is the time right to act? In the 3D world, the 3D response first. Wait and see. In the 3D world, the 4-word answer to is the time right to act. The 4D world, and the 4D answer is you wait and see. That description, I want to tell you, is absolutely devoid of any attempted, insinuated cynicism. The reality behind it would give a whole new definition to the piss-poor mortal definition of cynicism. Cynicism is lack of perfect data. In the 4D world, as I promised, the answer to the question, is the time right to act? In the 4D world, the answer is wait and see. But in the 4D world, time equals wait. Wait equals time. And time doesn't wait. But the question of, is it the time to act? Is it the time that I at least feel that I should be pursuing something within this triaxial dance of CD and whatever E is? But is the time right? Remember the green watercolor representing the continuing, non-stop, all-encompassing backdrop behind the dance. Wait and see in the 4D world would be not any form of cynicism, not any form of hold it. Wait and see would be on the basis that wait, in the 3-word description of wait and see, wait actually means time. I'm going ahead and present that other aspect that I mentioned and then said I wouldn't mention. Need to tie up as many loose ends as possible each night, don't we? Excuse me. Vis-a-vis the apparent struggle going on within everyone or vice versa. Seems to be the struggle between 2 aspects in you. The real revolutionist knows that the recruits must feel as though, even believe, that there is an identifiable, proper target for their aggression. Or for those of you of delicate sensibilities, target for their dissatisfaction. That as nebulous at times as the struggle may sound when I talk about it, as I pointed out earlier, a few paragraphs back, everyone has the sensation, you got no choice, that this is a struggle where there'd be no possibility of progress, or of movement. I can feel it. It's not theoretical. I feel that it's me struggling against something in here. Well, let me go ahead and expand the area of inquiry, the area for consideration. Would-be revolutionists have got to feel, and as I said, then believe. That is, be told. But they've got to feel as though there is a proper target for their aggression/dissatisfaction. But the further question I'll go ahead and present tonight is, should they be led to believe, should they go ahead and feel as though this battle, this struggle is actually with themselves, or is it with the ruling powers? Now, any of you that hear anything right then at the question, you will note that if you heard anything, you immediately had the assumption ring up just as fast as a carpet salesman during a sale standing by the cash register with your money in his hand, that immediately it rang up, well, it was obviously one or the other. I mean, it's obviously it's a struggle, me against something in me. It's not me against something out there, because you've talked enough, and I think I already knew it, that wife's not really the fault. Wife's not the one stepping and pissing on my own foot. It's me doing it to me. Remember one thing, when you got your choice of two possibilities, whichever one's the immediate answer in you, it's wrong. Doesn't matter which one it is, it's fucking wrong. But back to the question. Should the recruits be led to believe, encouraged to believe, that the battle is against themselves some way, or is it actually against the ruling powers? That's not interesting. That's useful. And it's not obvious that is the answer, because I've already pointed out to you, whatever the answer is that you have, it's not right. But the question remains. All such questions remain. I remind you of that famous painting. What was that Spanish, I forget his name, was that painting, you remember, with the door of a men's room, and the police have their guns drawn, and one of them saying, "Okay, Louis, we know you're in there. I'll rest my case." The question is wrong. The two possible answers are wrong, but the question remains. Or as Irving Berlin, he wasn't a painter, was he? As he said, the song is ended, but the melody lingers on. And the kid said he had no idea what that meant either. I do. One final note in the general regards that I have been mentioning tonight. Would-be revolutionists should be advised of this. I've tried to trick the information into your little libraries. But let me put it in more straightforward language. That there is a kind of method for dealing with propagandizing against governmental adversaries. And you got them. Whether you look at it right now as being a struggle between you and something inside of you or you and the ruling powers, there are the governmental adversaries. They're always there. But there is a kind of method to start off dealing with them. And that is, you try and make them believe that they may be terminally ill. This is not interesting. This is useful because many of you have already had this happen. And you stumbled, as I could have predicted. In a sense, you stumbled and you did it. But you make these adversaries believe that they very likely, they may be terminally ill. Now, it's surprising the shift in an adversary's part, a would-be adversary's part, when they believe that they may be dying. I don't think I have to stop long and say, think about it. Enough of you already thought about it. How many people would you, just at the ordinary level, tend to forgive? How many people would you no longer feel an adversarial relationship with if you found out, if you were led to believe that you're probably dying? Who's got time for petty squabbles, imaginary slights and insults in the past? You can make these governmental adversaries conceive of themselves as a kind of temporary structure. It is a kind of subtle, continuing convincing of them of their weakened or irrelevant position. Now, in case any of you and the kid here really believe that we're back to the binary world and I was talking about something out here dealing with absolute adversaries, try and listen real quick. The times that many of you have been through that apparently you were head on, either what appeared to be out there or what appeared to be in here. Makes no matter. There seemed to be something going on in the part of you that seemed to be the part of you that you want to pursue. It seemed to be the part of you that brings you here and can hear some of this. It seemed to, miraculously so, unexpectedly so, seemed to have taken the day, seemed to have won that little skirmish. It seemed that you had seized some kind of new power. It seemed, in a completely unexpected way, that you got through this expected turmoil, that you could almost turn upon this heretofore adversary, heretofore extremely powerful adversary, and it's almost here in a moment you look like, ha, for the first time in my life, here's the feeling, absolute chemical feeling, no matter what words may have gone through your mind after the fact, was however it happened, I got the son of a bitch down in the game of dominance and submission. For the first time in this situation with this particular adversary, I seem to, well, not seem to, I am. I'm dominant. I got my foot on his damn throat. Now, what many of you have already been through, and you did not know up here what you were doing, which is not necessary at the time. But from then on, when I'm describing this, is then take the willful, this new data, and use it as an attempted willful manner. Once you have gotten the superior position on somebody, it's like whipping a bully. They used to call it back in the 30s and the 40s at least. Fathers would tell their sons, yeah, that guy may be bigger than you and he's been kicking you around for 2 or 3 years and he kicks everybody else around. Well, let me tell you, son, stand up to him once, punch him in the nose one good time, and a bully will run away and never bother you again. Now, life's arranged the way life's arranged, but sometimes kids will do that, and they would find out, hey, it's true. He still beats up everybody else, maybe a little worse. They're having to take my share, but he won't fuck with me anymore. And he could obviously whip my ass, surely. He always did. In this 3D world, when you apparently have subdued this governmental adversary once, what you should do then is, even after you let him up, and you got to let him up, everybody gets up, is then you start dealing with him on the basis of, well, you seem to have lost some of your power. What's wrong? You don't look too good. You struggle not to fall right back into, to bounce right back into the position, the chemical position of the erstwhile relationship between you and this adversary. Of course, I'm using 3D words, but it's like you can treat it with mock concern. All of this being the subtle attempt to make the adversary begin to wonder, hopefully believe that he or she may be terminally ill. You can turn what seems to be a stable governmental official adversary into a sickly, hypochondriacally inclined temporary structure. Once you get an upper hand on anything, you have got to be, should I say, a goddamn fool or a common man to ever let that same adversary assume the previous position. Once you dance with the devil and you find that you can lead, and you go back next time and you begin to dance backwards, then don't look at me, don't go home in the mirror and say, what am I doing with a dress on again? I am being led around the dance floor again. There is a method to making those kinds that are in everybody's state, these governmental adversaries, these binary bureaucrats, is you can make them believe that they may be terminally ill. And it will change their apparent relationship to you just as much, if we were talking about ordinary life, as it would, as I mentioned, and I'm sure you can hear, that if you found out that you were probably terminally ill, the way you would feel about people that you now think you dislike. If this was the ordinary world, I would say that kind of stuff is really dirty tricks. But it's not. It's just bare minimal operating procedure. And it's not simply interesting. It's not simply some little brand new scenario I came up with of, ooh, some kind of internal struggle between you and dumb bureaucrats and adversaries, and you make them think they're sick. Make your habits think they're sick. Oh, is that the kind of crap you're talking about? Or making them think that certain opinions you got, that they're no longer valid or they don't have any strength? Ooh, is that the kind of stuff you're talking about? Hell, kid, I can't answer everything. Ask yourself. All right. I guess we'll all agree that I am not overly inclined to be melodramatic for the sake of being melodramatic. But I'm going to tell you a story. I have not ever bothered to write it down, or in some literary sense to flesh it out and to put it in some kind of real readable form. But I strongly suggest to you that as far as 1987, that this is as potentially explosive data as I've attempted to give out this year. This is either a preface to what I had mentioned the last few weeks, that I was threatening to give out some info that some of you were not going to find comforting at all. Some of you were going to find it if I put it in the way in which I was threatening to myself. Some of you would not even hear it. And it's simple. Ooh, verbally I can make it so simple. Nothing as complex as internal governmental adversaries and everybody being a state with bushes and fringes and governments and revolutionaries. So this may be a preface to it. Some of you, this may be as good as a more specific telling. So we'll see. I may let it. I encourage you to take this seriously. And I told her to leave me 10 minutes on the tape, and let's see how fast. Because it's going to be pretty simple. It's a story about, let me call it, one particular guy. Now, all of you know that doesn't mean a man. It doesn't necessarily mean a woman. But as much as I play and tear the language, I don't have time to fool around with trying to say chairperson. One particular guy, man or woman, is always discovering and remembering via this newly true situation a certain fact. There's always a particular guy on this planet that's always discovering and expanding a fact, a living fact. And that is that man, and everything else to varying degrees, but that man himself is a living R&D laboratory. And a particular guy in every generation at any time on this planet is newly discovering this and updating it. He newly discovers it, and he also newly discovers it through his genetic memory. Now, just as they assume now that the stars, that all matter evolves itself, that they accept it now as a scientific fact, which this story is not based upon the condition of the correctness of scientific fact, but I'm simply pointing out to you that that fits into my story. That reality as it's assumed to be now fits into the information, or else the information would not be useful. That just as matter itself, including humans, evolve itself, that you have atoms one by one building themselves into structures more complex, that you have taken a simple running through of the world of 3D elements, of the apparent going by the atomic number, of going from hydrogen to helium to lithium to beryllium, that if you could look at that and try, like always, to, if you can push it past the 3D world, all right. If not, just listen. On the basis that if you looked at it as being this continuum of hydrogen in some way under certain theoretical, if not actually seen conditions, of atoms of hydrogen colliding and fusing in such a way that they produce the next stage of helium. And likewise with helium, going on to lithium and all through the periodic table. If you look at the elements as being alive, they all still exist. But just because helium was able, on its atomic base, the nuclei could combine in such a way to produce a new element, a more complex element of helium, hydrogen did not cease to exist. And after helium complexed itself into becoming lithium, that was not the end of helium. It was not the end of hydrogen. They all still exist. Am I correct? Yes. But what if you looked at it in a not unfair view in my story as this being a continuation, an exemplary picturization of the evolution of all matter, including man? There would be a kind of memory surely involved, that beryllium should remember when it was simply a form of lithium. And lithium should remember when it was some kind of form, a potential form, to be derived from helium. But no. In the laboratory of man, something else takes place. Now, as all matter has grown and atoms have built themselves up into more and more complex structures, so too has man. But looking at man as a kind of conscious combination of elements, as the stage progresses, he has either forgotten at each stage, or else he redefines his memory of the prior conditions. And one way in which I can describe this tonight, there are other ways I could describe it, but the situation, to take these 4 stages, which is enough for me to give you one example that this is a fair detailing, is if man were now beryllium, and he tried to look back his memory of his past, of going from the simplest observable element into the more complex, he would not remember the stages in any way in which they occurred. The description I give you tonight is man as beryllium, so this one particular guy observed. He would look back upon the stage of lithium as being really just a part of himself. That's the whole attitude of beryllium toward lithium. It's one of my components. There's really nothing else to be said. Then it would look back a little further in this description. It would look upon helium, where its attitude toward helium would be almost as though that stage didn't exist. It would be kind of a blank space in history. Now you can call it an experience of forgetting or an experience of ignoring. I just hint to you 2 words, but it would be as though that were almost a blank spot in the history of beryllium. Now when you go back further, when you get into the 4th stage, beryllium's attitude, its recollection now of hydrogen, would be such that it would create a whole mythological world for hydrogen. Now this one particular guy discovers something further. He discovers that man, he rediscovers, as always. And I'm bringing this up to more or less contemporary times, my story. This one particular guy discovers man, the laboratory, now with a speaking and a thinking machine. Somewhat like a computer, except it truly seems to think, it speaks, And everyone else accepts this thinking machine in the laboratory now as being their spokesman and their actual thinking apparatus. But specifically, they take the thinking machine as being entirely new. They take it as being a separate entity, and they see it as being electronically run. Now, this one particular guy, he discovers that the thinking machine is actually fueled by chemical fumes. I'm telling you what he discovers. In every generation, this one particular guy, he rediscovers and he expands it. The knowledge expands. There are fumes arising from a continual chemical reaction in the laboratory, and these fumes fuel the thinking machine. Everybody else seems either blatantly blind to this fact, or else everyone has known it and they have forgotten it, that it fell within my little story of the elements of beryllium, disremembering, redefining, forgetting, imagining whole new backdrops for its, pardon me, elementary past. The one guy discovers something else, getting closer to the heart of the matter. He discovers that the fumes arising from the chemical reactions in the laboratory crank up the thinking machine every morning. But this one particular guy discovers that he apparently has no control over the mixture of the chemicals from day to day. This one particular guy also discovers that under all known laboratory conditions, this process of the chemical fumes running the thinking machine is a flow of energy that only runs in that direction, not the other way around. And yet, everybody else, by now, everybody else believes that the thinking machine either does, can, or should be directing the chemical reactions taking place in the laboratory. Everybody. This one particular guy sees it, discovers it anew, and expands it every generation. That the process of the fumes cranking every morning and then fueling the thinking machine, this process cannot be reversed. It does not go in the other direction through any apparent means. A little bit further, all apparent anomalies in the thinking machine are studied by everyone else and then believed to be simply flaws in the wiring system of the electrical currents. And that any such anomalies are obviously in the thinking machine itself. Everybody believes this, individually, collectively, all the institutions, all those who study, all those who come up, those who stand outside the human laboratory, from scientists to philosophers, that any anomalies, any irrational acts, any apparent self-destructive thinking arises from the thinking machine itself. It's just obvious to them. And this one particular guy discovers that's not true. The one particular guy, in a sense, is always amazed at his own atomic memory, and likewise amazed at the lack of it in everybody else. That an apparently uncontrollable, unpredictable chemical mix happens each and every day, and it is not the same each and every day, and the fumes run this thinking machine that grew out of the laboratory. That a thinking machine that by all accounts, by all that's known to us, that is everybody else, by all that is reasonable, all that is logical, the thinking machine is electrical. It is electronic. It is what it is itself, it's responsible for itself, and this one particular guy sees that the son of a bitch is run by fumes arising from an unpredictable chemical mixture. I assure you that this lab situation is both expansive and explosive.